When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
There were a whole number of Chinese agents around Andrew, and that's true of the Russians as well.
This week on Disorder, we bring you insider revelations about former Prince Andrew's dealings with Jeffrey Epstein.
Elaine was a sexual partner of both Epstein and Andrew.
I'm joined by historian Andrew Loney, who uncovers the conspiracy within the royal family.
These are people who were completely immoral and were able to exploit the system.
To hear it now, go to disordershow.com/latest.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Longtime listeners know that with each presidential series, I try to focus at least one episode on the First Lady. And this time with the Monroe series, it proved a little difficult. And as some fellow podcasters I know have experienced when covering Elizabeth Monroe, we unfortunately suffer from a lack of resources with her. And so with this episode, I decided to expand out a little bit and talk about both of her daughters as well, because they, as we will see, played a role in the Monroe White House. But before we get to that, I wanted to share that I am joined by a special guest today. Ann Foster is the host of the Vulgar History podcast and the author of the newly released Rebel of the Regency, The Scandalous Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's Queen Without a Crown. I am so excited to have Ann joining us today. Ann, thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. I think we've been social media friends for a long time, so it's nice to officially collaborate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about podcasting is being able to have an opportunity to collaborate with fellow podcasters, because I have greatly enjoyed not only engaging with you on social media, but also listening to your episodes. You always bring a unique perspective. You bring to light figures in history that have not always gotten as much attention. And in particular, I cannot wait to read your book, because Caroline of Brunswick has been one of those figures I didn't really know much about. But once I started studying her, it was like, oh my gosh, I need to know more. And so kudos to you to really do the deep dive into her and help to bring her story to light. But before we go any further, I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about your work as a podcaster, as an author, just all the amazing things that you do.
Thank you so much. I really empathize when you were saying about it was so hard to find information about Elizabeth Monroe, and that's so often the case. So my podcast, Vulgar History, it's a women's history podcast, and it's kind of unearthing these stories of people who you don't hear about. And one of the reasons you don't hear about them is exactly what you found with Elizabeth Monroe. It's just there's not a lot written down. So a lot of my work has been kind of hunting down these stories, finding what sources there are, and bringing these figures to light, because for so long history has been the stories of, presidents, but we don't know about their wives, we don't know about their daughters, or kings, figures like that. So on my podcast, my current season, I'm talking about the Regency era, which actually, so that's kind of the early 1800s in England, but that coincides with what we're talking about today. There's some overlap there as well. And That's what I'm doing with a podcast. My book, Rebel of the Regency. It's a biography about Caroline of Brunswick, I've been practicing explaining this to people because it's hard to explain a biography of someone who's little known, you know? But my starting point, I will say for listeners of your podcast, is the American Revolution. Everyone knows about that. And so the king who was the king when, the colonies achieved independence was George III. George III was married to Queen Charlotte, who Charlotte, North Carolina, and other places are named after. Queen Charlotte is also the queen on Bridgerton, if you watch that. And Caroline of Brunswick is their daughter-in-law. So just to orient her within kind of figures you might have heard of and a time period you might have heard of. And like you said, Caroline of Brunswick, she's someone who is very little known. When I kind of stumbled across her story, I thought, this is, first of all, a great story. I think this will be a fantastic book. And it is, if I do say so myself. But also, I think she's just one of these figures who existed, like the people we're talking about today, during these very famous times, around a lot of very famous people. And so just elevating kind of these background figures a bit, I think it just helps flesh out our understanding of history.
Absolutely. And, something that you said, that they are existing in this pivotal period in history. There's so much going on. And one of the things that I know I try and do in presidencies, and I know you try and do with Vulgar History, is helping us to understand the humanity of folks in those times and how these times would impact folks, and in turn, the influence that they had on what was going on at the time. And that's just such an amazing thing to think about, because it gets to the history that isn't always discussed with so much of focus on dates and, the memorable moments, the battles, the this, the that, the things we memorize, getting to the humanity of it all.
Mhm.
It's so important.
I think so too. And I'm just thinking about, like, with what you cover in your podcast, so much of these figures, you just see a portrait. And so you imagine, well, they were always dressed up. They were always looking very formal. And so you just imagine these kind of godlike figures where it's like, no, these were real people and they had a cold and they were cranky one day. And I think it's important to demystify these great figures that you only sometimes imagine as these portrait perfect people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we'll see as we go along, the Monroes definitely weren't perfect. It wasn't the poster card family that we may imagine.
Can I ask one question first? I know you've been doing this Monroe series. So I'm a Canadian, and I'm just curious to know, is Monroe a well-known president? Is he well regarded? Like, he was in this very pivotal time period. I personally hadn't heard of him, but I've heard of Washington and Jefferson.
Really, Monroe, the main reason he is still well known is because of the Monroe Doctrine. That's really what he's known for the most. And it's interesting, listeners of the podcast, we'll explore this in the series. There was so much going on, but I think that there's this mythos of the era of good feelings, that it was just a time that everything was placid, everything was just calm, and it really wasn't. And when you start to dive in and you really start to understand what is going on in this time, and there are so many key moments that we will get to, the Missouri crisis, the Missouri Compromise, that would have impacts decades down the line, and in many ways were precursors to the American Civil War. And so this is a pivotal time to study. It doesn't always get that much attention, and Monroe is one of those presidents. He unfortunately suffers from being in that in-between time between Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, these larger-than-life figures that everybody else kind of sometimes pales in comparison.
Well, and that's similar to what I look at with British history. You hear about Queen Victoria, and prior to that, you hear about maybe Henry VIII, and then there's this kind of messy middle part where you don't really know. And so many pivotal things were happening, but yeah, just these larger-than-life figures really kind of take over, so you don't really know about the people in between.
Well, and with that said, let's get to know some of these folks. Let's go ahead and start with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was born Elizabeth Courtwright. She was born to Captain Lawrence Courtwright and Hannah Aspinwall Courtwright on June 30th, 1768. And she was the second of 5 children who were born to the couple. As described by historian Tim McGrath, quote, "For nearly 125 years, the Courtwrights have been among the leading families of New York. They were not Dutch, but Flemish, arriving in New Amsterdam in 1663. They bought land along the Bowery, and later they moved up to Harlem. And so her father was this successful, wealthy merchant, but with the coming of the Revolution, because 1768, it's only a few years later when everything really starts to kick off, Lawrence supported the British cause, which put their prominence into question. And this is something that we've seen in other episodes of this podcast. And anybody who knows the American Revolution, this becomes that time you've really got to pick your sides. And if he's picking the British side, but still in New York, that's potentially a problem. And so, unfortunately, her mother, Elizabeth's mother, Hannah, died in childbirth in 1777 when Elizabeth was 9, which meant her paternal grandmother stepped in to help raise the young children. And again from McGrath, quote, compared to many women of their time, Elizabeth and her sisters were well educated. Their father's social standing gave the girls access to the best teachers in New York and exposed them to art, theater, music, and philosophy. Elizabeth spoke French with ease. And that's one thing that as we go along and study further First Ladies, education increasingly becomes important. But this is a time that is atypical for women to be receiving such a well-rounded education. And it's really due to her father's wealth that she has access to this.
Mm-hmm. And that would probably be, I would imagine, so that she would be prepared to be sort of a hostess and things like that, to, engage people in conversation at dinner parties, maybe play the piano or things like that.
Exactly. It was seen as being able to be that figure in the social sphere. And as we'll see, it would have some benefits to her further down the line because, especially when she gets with this guy named Monroe, they do a lot of traveling, and especially to France.
Yeah.
Which, speaking of, James Monroe and Elizabeth Courtwright met in New York City in 1785. And James at that time was in the Confederation Congress. And we talked about this in his pre-presidency episode. He was elected to the Confederation Congress. He went to New York, was in social circles. And so him and Elizabeth meet up. Now, Elizabeth's friends were not sold on James at first and, quote, confided that they had expected her to do better. And one of her friends even referred to Monroe as, quote, a not particularly attractive congressman. So her friends were not really on the Monroe bandwagon to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, James's friends commented on Elizabeth's, quote, New York air, which they felt made her seem aloof, but otherwise they felt the match was a good one. And so his friends, not 100% sold, but not quite as critical as Elizabeth's. But they managed to get through all that, and the two were married on February 16, 1786 at Trinity Episcopal Church in New York, and they honeymooned on Long Island. And at this time, James was 27 and Elizabeth was 17. So 10-year age gap between the two.
I'm going to say, based on my podcast work, this is by far one of the least large age gaps I've come across in a marriage for a 17-year-old. Yeah. I saw he was 27. I thought, oh, that's fine. But that's just how far gone I am.
Well, and it's one of those things, nowadays we're like, oh, that's a big age gap. But like you said, at the time, they wouldn't have thought anything about it. They may have thought, like you said, well, he's getting married pretty young. So
yeah, he's not 47. So I'm okay with it.
This isn't the second marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And historian Julie K. Fix notes that, quote, of the 4 Courtwright daughters' marriages, Elizabeth seemed the least successful at first. And again, putting this into context, so Monroe, he came from this Virginia planter background, but they were kind of the lower tier of the upper echelon. And so he was kind of seen as being a little beneath her. And there wasn't really, and we talked about this more in his pre-presidency episode, his prospects weren't seen as great. He did struggle financially throughout his life, and that became a problem for the entire family. But she was seen as being, he married up instead of, her marrying up, he married up.
And that would suggest to me that these were two people who liked each other, that this was a a love match rather than something arranged. The fact that the friends and the family were all kind of like, really? Kind of speaks to the fact that the two of them were drawn to each other. That's what I would imagine from the situation.
Absolutely. And again, that's part of the issue of not having as many resources to turn to, and in particular, primary resources. But from all indications, it does seem like theirs was a good marriage. And, as we go along, we'll see that he does evidence at times this respect for her. And so that's something that's important to consider as we go along. And so in October 1786, while Elizabeth was pregnant with their first child, they moved back to Virginia. So his congressional term had ended. He was actually term limited. He had served 3 terms. And so it was time to go back to Virginia. And they had to stay at the residence of James's uncle, Joseph Jones, in King George County, Virginia, at first because their new home was not ready. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, named after her mother, of course, was born on December 5th. And this daughter would be, to avoid any confusion, she would be called Eliza. And that's how we'll refer to her in this episode, because that becomes how she is well known through history. And so eventually they moved to their new home on Caroline Street in Fredericksburg in February 1787. And then in 1789, they moved west to Charlottesville, Virginia. And so we can imagine that there was a little culture shock, because even though Virginia overall was more of a rural setting, even though they had cities, they weren't cities like New York City. But at least Fredericksburg was a port city. There was still a bit of culture there. There was still stuff that would have been familiar to Elizabeth. Charlottesville was the frontier at this time. It was, the last vestiges of Virginia culture. And so you can imagine that it took a little getting used to. But Elizabeth did grow fond of the Charlottesville area, though she did complain that she missed her Courtwright family back in New York. And, we see this in other instances of folks who marry and then move away. At the time, with transportation as it was, communication was harder. Actually getting back home to visit family was harder. And so there was kind of this disconnect. And she missed her family. She loved her family.
Mm-hmm. And she's still incredibly young, too.
Yeah. To be separated from everyone and everything that you knew, we can only imagine how that was for her.
I'm just picturing, because she would be sort of the age of a college student, really. Like at this point, she's in her early 20s. She's just had a child. How she was described earlier as having these New York airs. So like she's a city girl, and now she's in the country, and she's got a baby. Like it's a lot, and she's not with her family. So yeah, we can imagine not having her letters or her diaries. We can just imagine this would have been a tough time for her.
Absolutely. But she did find her way. And one thing that really helped was that Monroe had a friend named James Madison. And being close to the Madisons, and especially when Dolly Madison came into the picture, so 1789, she wasn't there yet, but would be in a few years. But the Monroes and the Madisons would grow close, and James, and then when Dolly was in the picture, they were well connected with everybody. They wanted to know everything that was happening in the capital, in various parts of the nation. And so this kept Elizabeth well informed about what was happening back in New York. And she relied on the extensive correspondence that they had in order to keep up with what was happening back in her hometown. But when Monroe was elected to the Senate, the U.S. Senate, to represent Virginia in 1790, Elizabeth joined him in Philadelphia. Of course, this gets her back to the city. She's back in that environment that she knows. And she'd also have an opportunity to make trips to see her family, because even though transportation wasn't great at that time, Philadelphia was much closer to New York City than Virginia was. So it gave her that opportunity to make those visits. Historian Harry Ammon notes, however, that by the time of the end of the congressional session, Elizabeth, quote, was anticipating her return to the tranquility of the country with greater pleasure than in former years. And so it does seem like, even though, and we see this in life, we get used to something as children, as we're growing up. Then when we start out on our own, we get used to new things, and those become more comforting than the things that we grew up with sometimes. So we start to see this transformation in her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Elizabeth got a few years to enjoy some more time with her family before she and James were summoned to New York in February 1794 with the news that her father, Lawrence Courtright, was dying. Elizabeth was able to be by his bedside as James worked to sort out his father-in-law's business affairs. So she was at least able to get that closure of being with her father when he passed. And then a few months after Courtright's passing, James was approached by the Washington administration about assuming the post of U.S. Minister to France in Paris. James agreed, and he and his family boarded a ship bound for France in Baltimore, Maryland in the summer of 1794.
Can I just pause here for a second?
Absolutely.
Last year, I did a whole season about the French Revolution. So
Oh, nice.
going to Paris in 1794 is a big choice to make.
Yes, it is.
That's it's if you're gonna go, so going there would have involved some level of bravery, I guess. It's just kind of it's interesting to me, like, I think that's like when Robespierre is in charge and stuff, but they're trying to, the fact that they need a U.S. minister in Paris when things are so chaotic there is interesting. And they
Yes.
went, and it seemed like it was fine, but that's quite a time to be there.
Well, and it's interesting because the timing worked very much in their favor. They got there right after the fall of Robespierre. And so the Reign of Terror was coming to an end. They were starting to settle in to the new government. But yeah, and that was one of the things that is so fascinating about studying this ministry, because if they had gotten there a little sooner, it still would have been that chaos. And as we'll see, it wasn't the Paris that we think of, this beautiful city of lights. It was this devastation, The guillotines had been in full force. People were still terrified. So much was still in upheaval.
Do you think they chose him to go there because nobody else wanted to? Or do you think they chose him because they thought he would be a good person for this job? Like, where was he on their list of candidates, in your opinion?
They did have another person that they asked. They declined, and then they ended up with him, in part because a fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph, was Secretary of State at the time and recommended him. Part of why they wanted to send Monroe was because he was a Democratic Republican. He was closer aligned with Jefferson and Madison and this pro-French faction at a time that there was still some animosity between the U.S. and Britain. And so they were also trying to build a relationship there. John Jay, this was around the time that he was being sent as the special envoy to negotiate what became known as the Jay Treaty. And so part of the reasoning behind sending Monroe was they know that this guy likes France and he's been for the revolution. And so maybe they'll get along with him better than the arch federalist Gouverneur Morris that was the previous U.S. minister to France.
I did an episode about Gouverneur Morris. My podcast is usually women's history, but I found his story so interesting. So, so that's who he's replacing. Yeah.
Yes. And so that kind of makes sense. They would want him out of there. And so they arrive in Paris. They arrive, at this time of upheaval. And so upon their arrival, they originally moved into the house that was occupied by Gouverneur Morris. But in the summer of 1795, they moved into the Folie de la Bouillerie on the Rue de Clichy. And as noted by Ammon, quote, though the Folie was small, with only 6 principal rooms, it was a sumptuous structure in the fashionable style of a one-story pavilion. Set in the midst of superb gardens, the Folie had been constructed by a wealthy farmer general as a pleasure retreat. And so this became their home base. And this is where the Monroes entertained, quote, a social circle composed of visiting Americans, French officials, and personal friends. And Elizabeth managed, quote, a staff of only 7 servants, including a gardener, a cook, and a coachman. And so they're trying to establish themselves in this place trying to work with the new French officials. And meanwhile, there is still so many American business interests in Europe. And so they have these folks passing in and out. It becomes the social center. And meanwhile, Eliza Monroe, their daughter, quote, was enrolled in the Institution Nationale de Saint-Germain, a prestigious Paris boarding house run by Madame Campan, and her full name, Jean-Louise Henriette Campan.
And I came across during my French Revolution series. I forget what her relationship was exactly, but she was involved with Marie Antoinette. She's one of the people whose memoirs we really rely on to learn about that time in history. So
yes,
these connections I'm making in my head between what you're saying and the French Revolution stuff I read. Okay, all these people are intermingling.
Absolutely. Well, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, I didn't make a note of it, but I remember reading this somewhere. I think she was one of her ladies in waiting or something with Marie Antoinette. And so that was part of the impetus of sending her to this boarding school, because she knew French culture and how to navigate those circles.
And she had survived the revolution. So
not
not a lot of people had. So she's one of the last people left.
Kudos to her.
Who remembers all this stuff. Yeah.
And this is where Eliza would make friends with the daughters of many prominent French officials, including Hortense de Beauharnais, who was the daughter of Josephine de Beauharnais, or as she was known after her marriage to a young general from Corsica in 1796, Josephine Bonaparte. And even though at this time, still kind of a rising star, we'll see that this relationship is rather of an important one.
Mm-hmm.
And Eliza, and this is something that we'll talk about a little later, but there actually is a recent biography that came out about Eliza Monroe. It's the first one that's ever been, and the biographer, Barbara Vorndick, this was a wealth of information for this episode. And for anybody who hasn't read that book yet, I do highly recommend it. It's amazing to see her research. But Vorndick talks about this time in Eliza's life, and she shares that Madame Campan's, quote, curriculum was composed of both academic study and virtuous personal development, which, in addition to intellectual engagement, also taught skills such as sewing and cooking, even to the more well-to-do students. And what you said, Anne, about Madame Campan being the survivor, you kind of see this with this curriculum. It's not just about, the kind of education that her mother got, this intellectual education, but also these practical skills of what to do if things go wrong.
That's such a good point. Yeah, Madame Campan would realize now the importance of teaching basic survival skills to young women. Yeah.
Yes. So that was where Eliza was during this time. That's important to know. And we'll come back to Hortense as we go along. But it's during this time in Paris that we get the most famous story about Elizabeth Monroe. Because in early 1795, Adrienne de Lafayette, the wife of the famous hero of the American Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette, was languishing in prison in Paris. Though her husband had played a leading role in establishing the French National Convention in the early days of the Revolution, he was ultimately denounced by the Jacobins and ultimately taken into Austrian custody while attempting to flee to the U.S. And as was common in this time, and as you're well aware, during the Revolution, when one of the leaders is taken in, usually the family is rounded up as well and put into prison. And so Adrienne was languishing in prison at the Collège du Plessis in Paris. And the fate of the Lafayettes had become a cause célèbre for many prominent Americans who, they saw Lafayette as this great hero of the Revolution. They wanted to be able to save the Lafayettes. And the Monroes were determined to do something about Adrienne's situation. Thus, in early 1795, a finely equipped carriage with well-dressed servants drove to the prison, and a crowd started to gather around it. And so, again, imagining this Paris that was still devastated. This was one of the few carriages that was still on the roads. Most of the carriages have been broken up, destroyed. This is one of the few carriages that's still there that somebody can actually afford. And here it comes, it's well-equipped, and it pulls up to this prison. And so naturally, you can understand why people start gathering and kind of looking what's going on here. And the guards at the gate asked who was in the carriage. And they were informed that it was the wife of the American minister to see Madame Lafayette. Now, James knew enough about French politics at the time to know that their leaders were often responsive to public opinion. And what would get people's attention more than this fine carriage showing up at a prison, carrying one wife and mother, checking on another being imprisoned? And so this is really playing to the court of public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But also, one can't imagine that he would make this happen without Elizabeth's agreement. We don't know for certain, again, lack of resources, but I can't imagine that she would do this unwillingly.
No, exactly. So she was clearly involved in this plan. Like,
Yes.
to the extent that she's the one in the carriage. Like, maybe she came up with a plan. Like, this is one of the things where, we know so little about her, but it's like, well, here's a thing she did. And another woman maybe wouldn't have done this. So,
yes. And news of this interview, as they wished, this interview between these two women spread through Paris. And soon enough, Monroe and the members of the committee were in negotiations, which concluded with the release of Madame Lafayette. Adrienne made her way to the Monroe's home, quote, where she was received with the warmest affection. So, mission accomplished. Madame Lafayette is free. So, when James left office as U.S. Minister to France, the family returned to Albemarle County in Virginia, where in November 1799, they moved to a new homestead dubbed Highland, which bordered the plantation of then Vice President Thomas Jefferson.
Do you mean Monticello or a different plantation?
Monticello, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so this was one of the things with Jefferson, particularly with Madison and Monroe, but with a couple of others as well. He wanted everybody to move close to him. And he's like, there's this great place over here. I think, it'd be great to have you here. He wanted this social circle kind of surrounding Monticello of all of his friends, the people that he really cared the most about. Monroe was really the only one who took him up on it, besides the Jefferson family.
Mm-hmm.
But so the Monroes moved to this plantation close to Monticello. And as described by Vorndick, quote, the dwelling house at Highland was a large farmhouse structure with wooden siding erected on a high, breezy rise. Though not grand like Monticello, it had a footprint of approximately 2,000 square feet, so certainly a gentleman's home. And for those who are interested, Highland is open to the public nowadays.
I was wondering if it's, yeah. So if you go to see Monticello, you can go to Highland also, have a little
yes. And a little further out, you can get to Montpelier. One of the fascinating things about Highland is that there is a home on the site currently. And for the longest, it was thought that this was Monroe's home. It's not.
Oh.
They actually started doing some excavations and I forget, there was a reason why. It wasn't that they suspected something was there, but then they found this structure of this home because it was always curious because the home that's there is kind of a small one. And they're like, well, I guess he just didn't have that. He didn't have that grand of a home. And they found the foundations of the original home, and it's much larger than they were expecting. There is a part that is still expected to be kind of like one of the outbuildings from his time, but now they know that that wasn't the original home. That wasn't the Monroe's home there. And so that's been an exciting development in fairly recent times. Like they've been doing excavations for the last few years, but it's really changed the narrative of interpreting the site.
Oh, that's so interesting because for a long time then people would think, wow, I guess this modest, frugal man just had this small house, and so that would become part of his narrative. And then it turns out, no, just kidding. Big house.
Yeah, really not that small. So,
yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because, with Vorndick's description, this comparison to Monticello. And again, that's part of why Monroe isn't as well known, because he's constantly compared to Jefferson and Madison. And so, and then there's Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still, if it would have been seen on its own, it still would have been seen as a fine house. And we see this, in terms of the operations there, because one of the things that we do want to make sure to stress is that this wasn't just Monroe, the farmer. This was Monroe, the plantation owner, and thus he did enslave individuals on this site. The Monroes enslaved around 45 to 50 people at this plantation, quote, who worked the fields, tended the animals, cooked the meals, and catered to the Monroes in the main house. So what wealth they have is built on enslaved labor.
Well, and earlier when we were talking about their time in Paris, the quote you read, I remember it said they only had 7 household servants. And I thought, only? But if this is this setup that Elizabeth would be used to, then I see why 7 would seem like a different situation.
Yes. And, that's something, and as we'll see as we go along, the story of the Monroe family in general is enmeshed in the system of slavery. And so that's important to keep in mind as we go along. But in May 1799, Elizabeth gave birth to another child, a son named James Spence Monroe.
I want to make one observation here.
Absolutely.
Which is when we were going along, because there was Eliza, and I just kind of thought, oh, I'm sure she had other children, and you just hadn't mentioned it yet, but she hasn't.
She hasn't.
So I'm going to, again, like not knowing her life story, but just kind of filling in the blanks. Like the fact that she had a child and she had another child, like presumably, like she's capable of carrying a child to term. So there's probably some miscarriages. There's probably some infant death because it's been several years. Like Eliza is a young woman by the time she has another child. So just filling in the blanks of her life, I feel like that had to have been part of it.
Absolutely. And that's important to note, Anne. And that's one thing with studying women's history in this time, because there is so much focus on the men. And we are, in some cases, dependent on what the men decide to write down. So, and I've seen this with Seat at the Table, with Vice Presidency series. Sometimes we do get accounts of, my wife suffered a miscarriage, this infant passed away. In other cases, we don't. And it just depends on A, what they chose to write down, and B, what survived to the present day to be able to know what was going on. But I think that's a good estimation to make, is that there were probably some miscarriages, infant deaths involved here, because it was a long period of time. And as we'll see as we go along, and we've seen this before in other instances, unfortunately, Elizabeth will start to suffer from ill health, and part of it may be due to problems with pregnancy, complications with pregnancies that may have led to some of this.
Exactly. It all kind of probably all sort of fed into each other. Like if she had health concerns, they were exacerbated by it. I don't often come across this in my research, somebody who has a child. And then how old was Eliza at this point? Like 12 or 13? Like she's, to go that long without having another child is pretty rare for a married woman in this era.
Yeah, because Eliza was born in, so that was 1786. And this is 1799. So, that is a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, thank you. Yes, that is important to note here, what was going on, and we can start to surmise and start to fill in some of the blanks here.
But, congratulations to them. They have a second child. They have a son. I'm sure this is very exciting for them.
Yes. And hold on.
I know.
Because unfortunately.
So we're building it up, but it's still the olden days, and it's still hard for children to survive.
It's still that time. But this year would be a momentous year, as later on in the year, James Monroe was elected governor of Virginia, and thus the family would move to Richmond for him to take up that post. Sadly, shortly after the young James Spence's first birthday, he contracted whooping cough and passed away in late September 1800. And the infant was buried in the cemetery of St. John's Episcopal in Richmond. James wrote to correspondents around this time that Elizabeth, quote, was so prostrated by the death of her son that she did not recover her health for many months. And as I've already alluded to, this would prove to be the beginning of what was a pretty steady decline for the rest of her life in her health. Now, though her condition was described as rheumatism at the time, Based on the description of her symptoms, it's believed that she may have had some type of autoimmune or inflammatory disease or a form of arthritis. It's also possible that she suffered from epilepsy. And again, we don't really know for certain, just folks trying to understand what was going on here based on what we get of her symptoms.
And I can speak to this just a bit from the research I did for my book, which is a very similar time period. Like this is about the late 1700s, early 1800s, which is when a lot of my book takes place. Rebel with Regency, available now. But there was various health concerns. The woman who I wrote about, Carolina Brunswick, had various health concerns. And I have friends who are doctors, and I just told them, like, these are the symptoms. Like, what would you think this is if you saw this patient now? Because back then there wasn't, like, this is just on the precipice where medicine was going to change, and they would start figuring things out, like, oh, maybe you should wash your hands before doing surgery. They hadn't figured that sort of thing out yet. So there wasn't really named diseases. It was like humors, like everything is cured with bloodletting. Like, I didn't realize that carried on so relatively modern. That
Yeah.
makes me think of ancient Greece or something. But that at this time period when she's, like, what year are we in? 1800? Yeah, like the doctors would have just been like, oh yeah, I guess she just needs some bloodletting. So they wouldn't have known, like, does she have an autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia? Like, these were not words that existed.
Yeah.
The concept of different diseases didn't exist yet. It was just kind of like, your humors are out of balance. So much in history, I find it really fascinating, partially because I have friends who are doctors, to describe a situation and say, like, what do you think this is? Because the doctors would, like you said, like, they would describe her symptoms, like maybe she had epilepsy, so it sounds like maybe she had fits. So just to try to, like detectives trying to figure out, what was this? What disease did people have back then? So just another instance of not just women's history, all history. It's just kind of like, we don't know what happened to this person. Like, they died of something.
Well, and it's interesting the catch-all diagnoses of the time, when you just had to say, oh, they've got something, but we don't really understand exactly what they've got. Case in point, William Henry Harrison, the ninth president, the one who's famous for dying a month after becoming president, it was put down that he died of pneumonia. His symptoms were not pneumonia. And it was just one of those catch-alls when they really didn't know what he really died of. Oh, well, it was probably pneumonia. That's fine. Just put
That's
that
what
down.
everyone gets. That's,
Yeah.
Exactly. So trying to figure out the health concerns of people from the past, it's something that I find fascinating. So she's just yet another person where, like, I think honestly, it was a lot of arthritis was happening to a lot of people. They're just like, oh, she just has a bad leg. Oh, she just can't use her hands anymore. Like, okay, what? Anyway.
Hold on. Exactly.
Yet, I just see your next note. So despite everything we just talked about, she became pregnant again.
Despite her poor health, Elizabeth did become pregnant once more and gave birth to a second daughter named Maria in 1802. So in 1803, James was offered a diplomatic mission by his friend Jefferson, who is now president of the United States, to negotiate for the purchase of the port of New Orleans from the French. James accepted, and the Monroes were soon on their way back across the Atlantic. And so this helps to put things into perspective. So she just had another daughter in 1802. 1803, when they travel back to France, Eliza is now 16. So big age gap between the two daughters. But Eliza returned to Madame Campin's school. But while Hortense de Beauharnais was no longer there, she did entertain Eliza and two of her classmates at the Château de Saint-Leu. Eliza's friendship with Hortense after her stepfather Napoleon became Emperor of the French in 1804 would be a constant point of attack for Monroe's critics, who would say Eliza was, quote, tainted by association with European royalty and was, quote, a conceited snob.
That's funny because of how Elizabeth was described as having New York airs. Like, it seems that's just kind of how the women in this family are attacked for just being a bit too full of themselves.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, once we get to Monroe's time as president, we will see the same thing. But it's also interesting thinking of, from the American point of view, that they viewed Napoleon as being this aristocrat, this royal. Meanwhile, everybody in Europe, the actual royals, were like, oh, well, he's just, He's just
Yeah.
this gutter trash. He's new royalty.
Yeah. No, you're right. That's so funny that they were the two different ways he was seen. Yeah. When Napoleon was really kind of a, working class
Yeah.
dude who just became emperor.
Exactly. But so this is important to note, that this impression of Eliza is coming up. For James and Elizabeth, the second tenure of France would expose them to more of the finer things in the more opulent First Empire period.
Sorry, I just want to interject as well.
Oh, go right ahead.
No, just compared to the first time they went to France, and it's like the guillotines are still set up, like buildings are destroyed. Everyone, like riding in a carriage is a major enough thing that everyone's interested. And now they come back, and everything is, it's Paris is doing better. So
Yes.
a nice change for them, I would think.
Absolutely. Because, and again, knowing, don't want to go too far down the Napoleon rabbit hole, but that was one of the things he wanted this finery. He wanted things to look opulent because he was trying to build his reputation. He was trying to establish himself as, the first in this line. He wanted to establish this dynasty. And so he wanted to appear just like one of the other royals.
I'm picturing Elizabeth. She's traveled so much. She's going to so many different cities. This seems like this would be maybe a nice place for her to be.
Absolutely. And indeed, Emperor Napoleon would refer to Elizabeth as La Belle Americaine. And the Monroes were the only Americans present for Napoleon's coronation in December 1805, though they were seated, quote unquote, with lesser officials than with the other diplomats of equal rank with Monroe. So interesting, the pecking order here, but also they were the only Americans there.
And Napoleon's coronation, I just know from my research, it was what you were just describing about Napoleon. He made this the biggest coronation in history. It was the most opulent, the most elegant. So, like, what a thing to attend, to be the only Americans there.
Absolutely. And like you said, Anne, a far cry from what they experienced the first time.
Exactly.
And the Monroes enjoyed being in the midst of the culture of the time and acquired, quote, a lasting predilection for both French decorative arts and for French social usages. And again, this would come back up in Monroe's presidency and would at times be used to attack him.
Mm-hmm.
So James's diplomatic work sometimes took him away from the French capital. In 1804, when he had to travel to London for a bit, he took his family with him. But Elizabeth and Maria remained in Paris in 1806, while James went to Madrid for an unsuccessful attempt to acquire the Floridas for the U.S. Elizabeth and Eliza, and presumably Maria as well, were able to take a trip together to Bath in England in 1806, quote, to take advantage of the healing properties associated with the mineral water there.
I can speak to that just a little bit because Bath was a place so many people went in the Regency era, which I've been studying a lot lately. And so I wonder, Elizabeth's various health concerns are similar to various health concerns lots of people had at this time, maybe arthritis, maybe other things that today people are advised to soak with Epsom salts or things. Like, I'm glad that she was able to go there, and I hope it helped her a little bit. But it was also a place to see and be seen. So I think their level of prestige with these roles they have because of James's position, they would probably be welcome to, tea with the various people who were there as well.
Absolutely. And it is interesting, I've noticed this more with figures, in the American context. It's places like White Sulphur Springs in Virginia that folks are going to. And it is a place where, these well-to-do folks, the famous politicians and business people and their families get to intermingle. And so there is the health aspect of it, but also the social aspect.
Yeah, exactly. I think sometimes that sort of thing is called soft diplomacy. What
Yes.
women can be doing the socializing informally while the husbands are doing something else. So if the wife can make friends with the wife of another important person, then maybe the husbands can work together. So maybe that was part of it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this was a very exciting time for them. This was 4 years of kind of being in the midst of all of this, of this pivotal time in European history. And then it was time to go home. So in late 1807, the Monroes made their way back to Virginia. And when they arrived in Norfolk on December 13th, 1807, as described, quote, Maria, now 5 years old, provided onlookers with quite a show as she pranced about in her French outfit of ruffled pantaloons, stepping lively and twirling in a celebration dance alongside the little spaniel her parents had gifted to her while in Europe.
I need to say at this point, when I was looking through the notes earlier, I thought, oh, Mariah, I think she's my favorite character now. I think she's someone who maybe could show up in vulgar history. Just this. But also, they were in France for 4 years, and she's 5. So she has only ever really known France. So I think that would really affect what her personality is like, what her accent is like, everything. And this just made me feel like, oh, Mariah, I think we're going to have fun with you as you grow up. And spoilers, we do.
So. We do. Well, and it is so interesting because, and you almost have like this idea. You think of like Shirley Temple and these little kids on the big screen. You have to imagine, like, for the folks in Virginia, that they're like, oh wow, what's going on here?
Well, because also, I mean, and you know more about this than I do, obviously, but America at this point, like after the American Revolution, it took decades to kind of build up so that you have like a nice city, so you have nice things, so that like people are still, I would imagine, for the large part, still kind of struggling in the aftermath of that period. And then she shows up, Shirley Temple, in her ruffled outfit from France. Like, okay, she's going to stand out. Yeah.
It was quite a show for the folks at Norfolk.
But this also leads into like what I'm sure we're going to get to, but how this family is perceived and their kind of otherness and their kind of European fancy ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, they have to reintegrate into American society, and especially, for Mariah still being so young and most of her life was spent in France at this point. But even Eliza, she still had large portions of her life in France, in Europe. You got to imagine that it did take a little time for them to kind of get used to, oh, this is how things are here.
Well, it's sort of like an even more extreme version of Elizabeth going from New York to Virginia, right?
Yeah.
This is going from Paris to like colonial era Virginia. Like, this is not the life that these girls were used to.
Exactly. But of course, they did try and work to reintegrate. They tried to work to get back to normal, or as normal as life ever gets. And it's interesting because this becomes a time of change for the family, because Eliza was wed less than a year later. So just back from Europe, and here she's getting married. Now, after a brief romance with Dolly Madison's cousin, Edward Coles, Eliza opted to marry a Virginia lawyer named George Hay. Now, listeners of Presidencies may remember that name, as he was the U.S. District Attorney, who prosecuted Burr in the treason trial in 1807. And so this is, shortly after that. He was a member of a group dubbed the Richmond Junto, who were prominent leaders in the state Democratic-Republican Party, and Hay had been involved for quite some time in Virginia politics. Now, despite his close ties with the mainstream Democratic-Republican Party, Hay served on the Central Corresponding Committee for James Monroe's short-lived presidential run in 1808. Hay was also a widower who was 22 years Eliza's senior, so much larger age gap here.
The next fact I find even more shocking.
Indeed, he was even older than Eliza's mother, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so when I was happy about Elizabeth and James's marriage because it was 17 and 27, I thought, oh, that's nice. This is why, listeners. This is what you said then too. Like, well, that was the first marriage for him, and so this is the second marriage for Hay. So he wants a young wife, and he finds one, and I'm gonna guess this is not only a love match. There must be some behind the scenes wheeling and dealing going on. There must have been. Why would she fall in love with someone older than her mom? Like,
Yeah. Well, and also, this was a time, and, we see this with these second marriages because George Hay already had kids by his first marriage. Typically, they were looking for somebody to step into that maternal role for the already existing children, but also possibly to have more children. And so you wanted somebody who was younger, who was able to do that. And so in comes Eliza, but then also this political connection and the fact that Hay was a supporter of Monroe at a time that Jefferson was pushing for Madison to become president is also interesting, that he's kind of hitching his wagon to Monroe and then ends up as his son-in-law.
I mean, we don't need to get into the numbers, but I feel like if he's 7 years older than Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is 10 years younger than James, so he's 3 years younger than, so those two men would be contemporaries of each other and married to mother and daughter.
Yes.
I'm just pointing out why this is gonna
it's kind of
yeah.
ick. Yeah.
Ick is a great word, yeah. But this is who she marries, so
Definitely feeling the ick with this one. And again, this is one of those things, unfortunately, we don't really have details about how this came about, like we've been doing, and we can kind of speculate. But what we do know is that they were wed in September 1808 and settled in a small estate that James Monroe gave them near Richmond named Ashfield. And soon enough, Eliza gave birth to a girl named Hortensia Eugenia Monroe Hay, named after Hortense de Beauharnais, and her brother Eugene. So
I think that's sweet to show just the extent of the friendship between those two girls.
yes. I mean, the fact that, not only her friend, but his brother, she incorporates both names into her first daughter's name is very interesting. And it does speak to, at least from Eliza's point of view, what an influence Hortense was on her. Now, as we discussed previously in the podcast, Monroe had a falling out with James Madison towards the end of his diplomatic tenure, and the two remained estranged for years. Finally, though, they reconciled, and Monroe was invited to join President Madison's cabinet as Secretary of State. Now, when he went to Washington to assume his post, he brought Elizabeth and Maria with him. As noted by Ammon, the Monroes' financial difficulties, quote, did not permit them to live on such a lavish scale as the wealthy Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, who hosted lavish balls and festivities. The British minister to the U.S. commented that they, quote, entertained very sparingly, which does not fail to be commented on in a place where good dinners produce as much effect as in any part of the world.
Do we know why I guess we know why they're not wealthy, because he was an up-and-comer and Elizabeth married below herself. They had this plantation, but clearly it wasn't making them soup. I'm just curious because in the Regency era, people have researched, have financial problems because of gambling addictions. But I feel like he just doesn't have money because he just doesn't have money. He's just not a wealthy person. That's all it is.
Well, and part of the problem is the years away. So both in terms of being in the U.S. government, but then also his diplomatic career, because he was away for so long. And we see this with so many folks who enter national public service, like even if they aren't stationed abroad, because of communication at the time, you can't really manage your affairs at home. You have to find somebody who you can trust. Monroe didn't really have that. The only person that he had was his uncle, and his uncle did what he could, but his uncle also passed away. And I believe, I'm trying to remember I think it was around 1805 when his uncle passed away. And so the next person that was closest to him was his brother, who he basically had to support because his brother, he tried to send him to school in Europe. He ended up partying away. And again, this is where we get to the gambling addiction and all of that.
Gambling debts, yeah, okay.
It was the brother. And so he was having to support him, which meant that he didn't have as much. His brother would try and help around the plantation, but that really wasn't what he wanted to do. Affairs there were a mess. And meanwhile, Monroe is either in Paris or Washington. He's somewhere else where he can't manage it.
Okay.
And even though we look at we look at the salaries of the time for officials, on paper, it looks great. But you also have to take into account you're having to support an entire family, 2 households. Also, there's an expectation for cabinet members to host dinners and all that, and that's being paid out of that same salary. So really, it goes pretty quick.
Okay, no, that's interesting because I'm just thinking about like Thomas Jefferson or somebody had so many relatives and his wife's family. Like I guess he had debts too from his
Yeah.
construction. But anyway, it's just interesting that the Monroes stand out in this way versus
Yes,
other people in similar positions.
absolutely. Well, and again, we'll see when they get to the White House, there are similar complaints. But still, the Monroes were noticed by Washington society, with Sarah Seton remarking on Elizabeth at Gallatin's New Year's ball in 1813 that she, quote, has an appearance of youth which would induce a stranger to suppose her age to be 30, in lieu of which she introduces them to her daughter, Mrs. Hay of Richmond. So when folks are like, oh, you look so young, you've got to be like 30. Oh, here's my daughter. The distance from Charlottesville prevented them from getting back to Highland too often, but Monroe had another property in Northern Virginia named Oak Hill, which became a frequent getaway for them.
Oh, and this is what you mean. He has the 2 properties to maintain. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and now 3 because they've got a house in D.C.
Yeah.
I think at this point they were just renting the house in D.C., but still had to maintain the household. But now they've got another estate. And this one, and, not to get too far ahead, this would be a home, after Monroe leaves the White House. We'll see this is where they retire to. And funny enough, I think it was like 2 months ago, the owners of Oak Hill, so it's been held privately since, they are selling it. It's going to become a historic property open to the public, which is going to be interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so they at least had a place that they could escape to, get out of DC for a little bit and just have that family time. Now, despite his extensive responsibilities in Madison's cabinet with the coming of the War of 1812, Monroe frequently expressed his concern over Eliza's health after she suffered either a miscarriage or stillbirth in early 1812. And thus, with the end of the war, Monroe went to Ashfield to reunite with Elizabeth, who had preceded him there. He also wanted to visit with the Hays, check on Eliza, and take a bit of a respite himself. And for those who have heard in the podcast, basically Monroe at one point was running the State Department, the War Department, and anywhere else that he kind of had to fill in during the war. It was a lot. And so at the end of the war, he was just exhausted.
Monroe, and I'm going to have to listen to your other episodes to get the full understanding of this, but when I asked before about, why did they send him to Paris? It just seems like he's the guy to do a good job. He's just going to go in and he's going to do it and you can trust him. And so that's like so many people in so many workplaces, they just keep giving him more and more jobs because I respect that he's someone who gets stuff done. That's
absolutely
not every historical man, politician in this era was like that. So I can see why they kept bringing him in to clean up the mess.
Absolutely. And even though, were there folks who may have been better at military matters than Monroe? Sure. They also weren't there and they needed somebody. And he was that guy you turn to when you're in a jam, you need somebody. He's going to be there and he's going to do it to the best of his ability. You could trust him on that.
And I feel like in this time and era, which again is still so shortly after the American Revolution, like you need someone you can trust. And clearly a lot of people trusted him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, to your point, Anne, those folks in the workplace, they end up getting exhausted.
Burnt out.
Yeah. It's just like, oh my gosh, I can't do anything more. But, they're able to get this time together as a family. And then the Monroes and the Hays go back home to Highland. Though James tried to convince George and Eliza to move to Albemarle County, he was at this time thinking of moving the family to Oak Hill in order to be closer to Washington. since it looked by that point in 1815 that Monroe was likely to succeed Madison to the presidency. So he was like, this is going to be another 4 or possibly 8 years. Maybe we need to move a little closer, have somewhere that we can get away to. Now, Elizabeth's health, unfortunately, continued to deteriorate to the point that James wrote to President Madison on April 3rd, 1815, that his wife, quote, left her room only to join us at meals, but is in too delicate a state to leave the house. So it's getting worse for Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the 12-year-old Maria Hester was described by her father around this time as, quote, a most excellent child without fault that we discover, and with the best qualities. She is apt at school and getting forward in reading, writing, and drawing. And so when Monroe was elected president, Maria was sent to boarding school in Philadelphia, while the rest of the family prepared to move into the president's house. We're going to pause this episode here and pick back up with the next episode, where we discuss how Elizabeth, Eliza, and Maria navigated James Monroe's tenure as president and beyond. Special thanks again to Ann Foster from the Vulgar History Podcast for joining me for this episode. While you're waiting for part 2 of this episode to launch, be sure to check out Vulgar History by going to vulgarhistory.com or by searching for Vulgar History wherever you get your podcast. Anne is also the author of Rebel of the Regency, the scandalous saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's uncrowned queen. So be sure to check it out as well. I'll have links to both Anne's podcast and book on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to learn more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Special thanks to all of our patrons for all of your support to ensure that I have the resources and equipment I need to continue this expansive and in-depth journey through U.S. presidential history. If you'd rather not contribute monthly, but would like to support this work, I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidentiespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. Word of mouth is still the most effective marketing out there, even in the 21st century. So please share information about the podcast on social media or with friends and loved ones who love history. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
In 2021, the wife and son of Alex Murdaugh, an attorney from a prominent South Carolina family, were found shot to death. The story captivated the nation. That's when we began the podcast Impact of Influence. In March of 2023, Alex Murdaugh was convicted of murdering his wife Maggie and their 22-year-old son Paul. The latest, Alex Murdaugh was granted a new trial by the South Carolina Supreme Court citing jury tampering. The case will be tried before the end of the year, and we will be on top of it. Get Impact of Influence wherever you get your favorite podcast.